our time together today is coming to a close, but we have one more important exercise to cover before we wrap up for the day. So this morning when we did the peak credibility game, I asked you to get really narrow with your topic of expertise and get very specific and get into a niche. Well, this exercise is doing the opposite. Instead of zooming in, we're going to zoom out and look at how your small area of expertise can be expanded and can connect to larger topics and issues. So like all of the exercises and topics that we've covered today, this exercise has a story behind it. And that story is related to our founder, Katie. Now, as I share her story and go over this exercise, I invite you to keep in mind the topic of expertise that you selected for yourself this morning and think about how you would apply that to the exercise. Okay, so for the story, Katie wrote the book Little Red Riding Hood Uncloaked, Sex, Morality, and the Evolution of a Fairy Tale. And it was a few months before her publication date, and she saw the marketing materials for her book. And she was really upset. The marketing materials framed her book as being an academic book about fairy tales, and she knew from doing the market research that those types of books didn't sell very well. And also in the marketing materials, it literally called her the Little Red Riding Hood Lady. So she felt like her book and her area of expertise was much broader than that topic, and that she was being pigeonholed. But she thought, you know what, I'm a first-time author, what do I know? And they're a major publishing firm, so I'll sit back and let them do their job. Now, as her publication date got closer, she began to get more and more upset and felt more panicked. And she thought, oh my gosh, if someone doesn't do something soon, I'm going to be pigeonholed for the rest of my career as Little Red Riding Hood Lady, and my book is not going to do well. So she kept worrying about it, and finally she had an epiphany. And like so many of us, she realized in this situation the person to do something was herself. And so she sat down and said, okay, I'm going to take this afternoon and I'm going to think about this. I'm going to approach it from a couple of new angles. So any ideas how many angles she decided to approach it from?
Three.
Yep. So as you know, 3 has come up a lot today, and it has this magical property in the human brain. So she sat down and she wrote her niche area of expertise, which was Little Red Riding Hood, and she chose those 3 angles to look at it from. And as a journalist, she thought, you know what, I'm going to ask some journalistic questions like who, what, where, why, when, how. If I can answer at least 3 of these questions, I'm going to be a lot further along than I am now. So she did select 3 questions, and if you do this exercise yourself, you can pick different questions. But the ones she chose were who. Who is she an expert on? And she said, Little Red Riding Hood, the fairy tale heroine. And then she said, what? What am I an expert in? And she said, okay, Little Red Riding Hood, the fairy tale itself. And then she said, well, where is my area of expertise? And she thought about it and she said, it's a fairy tale, it's the nursery. Okay? Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
So she said, well, this is a bit better. I'm not just Little Red Riding Hood, I've expanded a bit. But I think that I can expand this even more. So she said, you know, what are the larger metaphors here? What are the bigger issues that I'm trying to address? So she tackled the what first. And this was hard for her. Fairy tale. This is how she had described her book, as being about fairy tales. But she really disliked that because she would say that she had written a book about fairy tales and she'd see people's eyes glaze over. And then one day she heard someone call it a myth. And she thought, I like that better. But as a folklorist, she knew that fairy tales and myths are very different. They come from different genres, they are indexed differently, and no folklorist would ever confuse the 2 or use them interchangeably. But then she thought, well, what about for regular people? And she realized that fairy tale and myth are different for them as well, but for different reasons. So for example, which one is bigger, a myth or a fairy tale?
Myth.
Yeah. And which one has more importance in our society, a myth or a fairy tale?
Myth.
Thank you, yeah. And which one would you say is more masculine, a myth or a fairy tale?
Myth.
Okay. So this was more than just a fun word game. It actually made her think, and she was like, well, you know what, I actually wrote my book in part to debunk what folklorists call the hero cycle, a body of research called the hero cycle. And if any of you have read Joseph Campbell or are familiar with his work, he addresses the hero cycle there. And the hero cycle is about the global protagonists that are in human narratives, or the stories that we tell over and over across centuries and continents. And virtually all of the protagonists in the hero cycle are male. It's as if female protagonists don't exist. But that's not true. We know this because folklorists trace stories the way scientists trace the evolution of a species. They collect and date samples, and they build a phylogenetic tree that allows us to imagine our origins. And so we know that the origins of many of our most popular stories are very different from what we know them as today. Most often they have different endings, and they have very different heroines. And this is true for Little Red Riding Hood. And in fact, the oral origins of Little Red Riding Hood, those stories are not ones that people would ever tell to children. They are sexual, cannibalistic, and violent. And while the details vary from country to country around this specific story, there is a common characteristic. The heroine almost always wins. And so Katie came back to this idea and was like, well, you know what, in part I did write my book to show that there are female protagonists. There have been, across all of our, human existence. And she wrote her book to show that stories about women aren't just small, domestic, and unimportant, while stories about men are huge, epic, and important. And yet she said, well, look, I just fell into the same idea with the language I was using. I was only using fairy tale to talk about stories about women instead of the term myth. So she decided, you know what? I am going to cross out fairy tale, and I'm going to say a myth. Because myth has more importance in our society, and stories about women are important too. But then she thought, okay, I need a way to talk about this with regular people in an approachable way. Fairy tale versus myth, that's very complicated. It has a long explanation. So I think what's more approachable is, instead of calling it a myth, to say stories. Okay? Does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
So next she tackled Little Red Riding Hood, the fairy tale heroine, her what? And she immediately said, you know what, I can cross off Little Red Riding Hood. Because my book, while it includes Little Red Riding Hood, and she's in the title, my book covers a lot of fairy tale heroines. So that's a more accurate representation of my expertise. But then she thought, you know what, I can broaden this more. She said, she reflected on her book and she said, you know what, I look at the heroines in a lot of genres. Not only myths and fairy tales, but also proverbs, Victorian broadside, Celtic lore, YouTube videos, pornography, feminist poetry, rock and roll, and Hollywood movies. So she really has this vast expertise in heroines across all the genres. So she said goodbye to the fairy tale and said, you know what, I'm an expert on heroines. But then she said, you know what, I'm going to expand it one more time. I think I can broaden it to something else. Any ideas what she may have broadened it out to? It's a person, a what? A who? I think you almost were saying.
Women?
Yes! Good job. Women. So before she did this exercise, she never would have dreamt of calling herself an expert on women, because she, like many of us, felt that in order to call herself an expert on a topic, she would have to know everything there was to know about it. And of course she doesn't know everything there is to know about women. But after doing this exercise, she realized that she had this direct link from her niche, her area of expertise, out. And she knew this stone cold. And she felt really confident and grounded in this knowledge because she knew there were very few people in the world who knew as much as she did about these stories. And so she could see her foundation and a direct link out to the bigger issues. And additionally, she thought, sure, I don't know everything there is to know about women, but who does? And I just spent the last few years researching and writing this book, which looks at stories told about women across hundreds of years from every continent, across centuries and different languages. I think I can call myself an expert in women. And so she did. Pass off heroines. And so then the last angle she looked at was the where. So she went back to the nursery and she said, oh my gosh, this is all wrong. I don't have children, I don't have a nursery, this book isn't for children. And actually across all the years that fairy tales have been told, it's only in recent history that they've ever been told to children. They were for adults. So she said, definitely not the nursery, but what can I put in its place? And so she thought, well, what attracted me to this topic and to these issues? What is it about it? Why am I interested? And she realized it's because they're so common. These stories have been told all over the world, from human existence, and they're probably the most common stories and narratives we have, the most popular we have in our society. And so she thought, well, what's the bigger metaphor here? What am I trying to talk about? And she decided it was popular culture. So she went from saying she was an expert in Little Red Riding Hood to being able to say, I can speak intelligently on stories about women in popular culture. And indeed, two of her biggest op-eds that she wrote in the early to mid-2000s were about women, stories about women in popular culture. She wrote an op-ed about Sex and the City, and then she wrote an op-ed about the remake of the Stepford Wives movie. But back to her book and her dilemma. So she did this, and she felt really good about it. And so she took it in, her ideas into her publisher. She didn't literally take her triangle in, but she did bring in the ideas. And she said, you know what, I think this is a better way to market the book. It's about these issues. It's about the stories we tell about women in our culture. And her editor and the marketing team agreed, and she had got to them just in time, so they were able to reframe her marketing materials. And they described her book as being about more than 500 years of the stories we tell about women and how they inform our lives today. So that's much better than saying it's a book about fairy tales. And it's clear that it has this huge historical longevity, and it's important today because it's how it talks about how these stories inform our lives today. And so this exercise and that new marketing tool really paid off, and her book sold out in its first printing pretty quickly and did much better than an academic book typically does. And it led to a lot of media opportunities for her, speaking engagements. And then just a few years ago, she became a consultant for a Gothic movie on Little Red Riding Hood that the producer of the Twilight series did. So she's still getting royalty checks from that. And she feels quite confident that none of this would have happened if she had not taken the time to look at the broader picture and how her niche area of expertise extended out and connected with larger issues. Does that make sense? Mm-hmm. Okay, so one more quick example to illustrate this. There was a woman who came through the op-ed project program a few years ago who said her area of expertise was the political implications of rumor in 18th century France. So that's very specific and kind of old. And so she felt, wow, I am so irrelevant and unimportant with my little area of expertise. But she sat down and did her own triangle exercise. And she realized that her broader area of expertise was really about the impact of informal communications in times of social upheaval. In particular, looking at France, at this time period, it was really the first time that people who didn't know each other were talking to each other about other people they didn't know. And at this time of social upheaval in France, and the results were revolutionary. So who better than her to talk about the changing ways we're communicating today through social media, Facebook and Twitter, which are also revolutionary and are changing our economy and globe. There are very few people, if any, who could speak about that issue and that phenomenon today with the historical context that she has. So she brings a very unique perspective and unique information to those topics. And just like with Katie, when she wrote her op-eds about Sex and the City and the Stepford Wives movie, she didn't talk about Little Red Riding Hood in those op-eds, but her knowledge of folklore did inform some of the metaphors she used. So I think this exercise is really great for allowing you to find that unique way that you can use your niche area of expertise to apply to the broader issues and to become someone who can speak out on a lot more topics than you maybe originally thought you could. So again, this morning we talked about the importance of getting really narrow and focused. There's a lot of times when that's important, but then there are times when it's important to see the bigger picture, to think, how do my ideas fit into the larger picture, and how can my voice and my knowledge make a difference in that broad way? So if you all decide to do your own triangle exercise at home tonight, I encourage you to start with that very small niche, that pigeonhole of your expertise, and then pick a couple of angles, ask some journalistic questions, and start building out. You can do more steps than this. You can get really broad out here and really think about what are the larger metaphors? How can I become more relevant? Okay, does that make sense?
Mm-hmm.
All right, thank you.
Thank you.